This project set out to answer the question, has the National Park Service achieved their intended goals of conservation and preservation of nature and human enjoyment since its establishment with Yellowstone nearly 150 years ago, and to what extent? The first national park was established with the goals of preserving the park for the people's enjoyment while protecting and preserving the land, plants, and animals in the park. Both of these goals have been achieved to a degree, and sometimes at a great cost. While the National Park Service has been successful in preserving and protecting land, some national parks have experienced issues of poaching, as well as human interference on the land and in the ecosystems of the parks as a result of the park's commercialization and increased tourism. In the decades prior to its establishment, Yellowstone was visited and documented by many expeditions, the first of which was by Lewis and Clark. In the following decades, many followed, including fur traders, miners, and explorers. They all brought home many written first-hand accounts of Yellowstone. The exploration that led to the creation of Yellowstone as a national park happened in 1871 under government geologist Ferdinand Hayden. He brought along William Jackson, a photographer, and Thomas Moran, a landscape artist, to provide visuals of their adventures. The images they created were the first visual proof of Yellowstone's beauty that caught the attention of Congress. As a result, Congress established Yellowstone National Park on March 1, 1872, through the Yellowstone Protection Act. Its purpose was to create a place for the benefit and enjoyment of current and future generations, as well as preserving and conserving the land, wildlife, and plants within it. The park was placed under control of the Secretary of the Interior. After the establishment of Yellowstone, numerous other national parks and monuments were created on federal lands for a similar purpose. At first, people struggled to achieve the original goals of the park. After the establishment of Yellowstone, Congress did not put any money aside for the management or protection of the park. Explorer Nathaniel Langford stepped up and accepted the position of superintendent, even though the job had no salary. He assumed that once a railroad was built to Yellowstone, thousands of tourists would come, covering the cost of the park. However, an economic crisis halted the railroad's progress, and very few people visited the park for the next few years. Without funds, the park was unprotected. Visitors took pieces of geysers to take home while hunters slaughtered elk. At this time, the park was under complete control of the Yellowstone Park Improvement Company. They were allowed to cut as much timber as they needed, kill animals for food, farm the land, and redirect some of the channels to the hot springs. A man named George Bird Grinnell was disgusted with this and began a fight against railroad interests and slaughter of animals. For the next few years, he lobbied to Congress and fought to stop attacks on Yellowstone. He even enlisted the army to stop poachers and vandals. After years of effort, in 1894, he finally got President Cleveland signed into a law an act to protect the park, including its geysers and wildlife, titled Act to Protect the Birds and Animals in Yellowstone National Park. After these initial struggles, things began to straighten out for the park. Through the Antiquities Act of 1906, natural, cultural, and scientific features were protected from collection ruin. In 1916, the National Park Service was created through the Organic Act. This act established a federal bureau in the Department of the Interior, responsible for protecting the 35 national parks and monuments. The National Park Service was established to, quote, promote and regulate the use of the federal areas known as national parks, monuments, and reservations, which purpose is to conserve the scenery and natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations.
However, these issues within the park are no thing of the past. Many of these issues, and some new ones, still affect the park in the modern day, even if they do so in a different way. For example, wolves, often villainized in the media, are actually essential predators in the ecosystem. These wolves were wiped out by hunters and are being reintroduced because of their invaluable service as one of the only real controls of the elk population. Without them, an increased elk population results in ripples throughout the entire economic and ecological system, as other species are overhunted by elk or can't scavenge off of as many dead elk. The reintroduction of wolves to the ecosystem by the National Park System, attempting to preserve a key factor in the health of the Yellowstone environment. A real effort to accomplish their goal of keeping the Yellowstone ecosystem intact. The hunters' persistence to hunt these wolves for sport is another example of the conflict between wildlife preservation and the public's interest and enjoyment of the park. The commercialization of the parks is one of the most obvious sources and manifestations of the conflict between the National Park Service's two goals. In 1883, the National Railroad reached the park's entrance, blocking the extension of the railroad. The park started to cement its role as both a physical and metaphorical barrier to industrialization, as industrialization started to cement its role as a barrier to the preservation of the park. The struggle between preservation and commercialization has been evident since the creation of the park. With the increase in commercialization comes the increase in tourism. Millions of visitors visit national parks every year. Tourists negatively impact national park lands in three different ways: depletion of natural resources, pollution, and physical impacts on the lands. Natural resources such as land and its aesthetic beauty can be ruined by facilities such as buildings and restrooms. The crowding of people cause stress in plants and animals. Vehicles such as airplanes, cars, and buses can provide noise pollution, harming wildlife and producing unnatural sounds. Visitors leave litter, which not only harms the environment, but also ruins the natural beauty. Visitors also trample land and ecosystems while hiking, camping, horseback riding, driving, etc., flattening soil and ruining ecosystems. Park visitors and leave disease and pollution for the environment to deal with. Entire ecosystems are affected by these man-made problems. The park is being commercialized in other ways than for tourism. There have also been attempts to harvest the resources within the park in hopes of economic gain. For example, biotech companies have been trying to extract certain bacteria from geysers at Yellowstone National Park in the hopes of creating new over-the-counter pharmaceuticals. However, these attempts at commercialization have again butted heads with the goal of preserving the park's condition, as many worry that the extraction process would damage the ecosystem and that the removal of these bacteria that are small yet important creatures in relation to the Yellowstone ecosystem as a whole. Despite the persistent efforts of humans to exploit the resources of our national parks, the National Park Service has been able to achieve some success in the way of their goals defined 100 years ago. The National Park Service still operates under those goals today, as their mission today states, quote, "The National Park Service preserves unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the National Park Service for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations." The Park Service cooperates with partners to extend the benefits of our natural and cultural resource conservation and outdoor recreation throughout this country and the world. This is done through many means, such as providing excellent service to visitors, partnerships, citizen involvement, education, employees, effective decisions and management, and research. The Park Service has, to a degree, accomplished both of their goals of environmental preservation and allowing the public to enjoy that same environment. But concessions had to be made for each in order to accomplish anything in the way of either goal. These concessions and accomplishments for both goals often came in the form of the commercialization of the park. Surprisingly, there is not a parasitic but also a symbiotic relationship between these two goals. Counterintuitively, not only do they contradict each other, but in some ways they support each other. The National Park Service's goals appear to be impossible and contradictory. Seemingly, they were bound to fail miserably on some front. Yet the National Park Service seems to have maximized to a reasonable degree their success in both fields. This relationship can be seen through the effects of the commercialization of the park. The public's access to the park has been restricted by a fee that has to be paid to get in, and the environment is compromised by those same visitors. Yet it is the revenue from these tourists and from selling the national park's resources is used to keep what remains of the park intact and functioning as the National Park Service spends it on protective measures. Throughout history, these new practices affected how we treated the environment and think of preservation. After Yellowstone, many more national parks were established, with Yellowstone as their model, along with a culture of conservation. This has not only been done through national parks, but this culture of preservation has taken root throughout society. For example, there has been the promotion of recycling and the banning of the use of environmentally harmful plastic bags in some stores. Yellowstone was one of America's first attempts at preservation. Its success inspired an increase of practices like it. Indirectly, Yellowstone's success, along with the success of National Park Service, has been a large factor in keeping America a neat, clean, environmentally healthy place for generations throughout American history and many more to come. Though the effectiveness of national parks has been debated, it can be seen that national parks have been fairly effective in succeeding in their original goals of creating a place for the benefit and enjoyment of current and future generations, as well as preserving and conserving the land, wildlife, and plants within it. Although there were struggles initially due to the lack of funds and human impact, such as tourism and commercialization have harmed our national parks, people continue to enjoy national parks today, and the National Park Service continues to preserve and conserve the land and wildlife for future generations.